Greetings from St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Knoxville, Tennessee, and from my household to yours on this Monday in Holy Week. As I said in the video posted yesterday on Palm Sunday, April 5th, 2020, I intend each day of Holy Week to take a segment of the Passion story according to Matthew, to read that segment in a way that you're invited to read along with me in certain parts, accompanying that reading with certain slides, photographs, some of which some of you may recognize. And then after the reading, there will be a brief meditation. So let us begin on the segment chosen for this Monday in Holy Week. A reading from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 26, verses 14 through 30. This reading includes Judas agrees to betray Jesus, Passover meal with disciples, and institution of the Lord's Supper. You are invited to read along with me on the parts in yellow font. One of the 12, who was called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What will you give me if I betray Jesus to you?" They paid him 30 pieces of silver, and from that moment he began to look for an opportunity to betray him. On the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Where do you want us to make the preparations for you to eat the Passover?" Jesus said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher says my time is near. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.'" So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover meal. When it was evening, Jesus took his place with the 12, and while they were eating, he said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." And they became greatly distressed, and began to say to him one after another, "Surely not I, Lord." Jesus answered, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born." Judas, who betrayed him, said, "Surely not I, Rabbi." Jesus replied, "You have said so." While they were eating, Jesus took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, Jesus broke it, gave it to the disciples, and said, "Take, eat. This is my body." Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will never again drink of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." When they had sung the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. The word of the Lord. So that was the story for today. In particular, I'd like for us to take a look at that part towards the beginning, when Jesus is at table with the disciples and Judas is still there. And it becomes obvious that Jesus has realized Judas is the one who will betray him, and he tells him to go do what he needs to do. But you know, it seems so pat, doesn't it? I mean, whenever I have felt betrayed, my first reaction is not necessarily to just tell the person to go ahead and do what they're going to do. I go through a lot of other things first. And I think that was probably true for Jesus. That we come in late in that time when he realizes that it's Judas who's going to betray him. And if we're really going to understand why Jesus could possibly be important for us, If we're ever going to be able to deal with the question of who is this Jesus for us, and who is this Jesus here at this time of knowing that he's going to be betrayed, then I think we've got to go back a bit and look at a backstory, some of which isn't written necessarily, but needs to be imagined. You know, there's a funny thing about backstories. For example, take this bowl, for instance. This bowl sits on the buffet in the entrance to my house. And you usually see it looking like this. It looks like just a plain, ordinary bowl. You can tell a little more about it when you get up on top of it and see that it has a wonderful design in it. But you know even more about this bowl if you know the backstory of it. The backstory of this bowl is that a very good friend of mine, someone with whom I was in college, made this bowl. She was an artist. She died in her 40s. She lived in Louisiana. And she really was a painter. She really wasn't a potter. In fact, as far as I know, this is the only piece of pottery she ever tried to make. And she gave it to me. Like other things that she gave to me that she had made, she never signed it. But on the bottom of this bowl, and you can't really see this, and even if you could, the letters might look backwards to you. But on the bottom, she didn't write her name. She scratched the word hope. So knowing the backstory of this bowl, whenever I see the bowl, I remember her. I remember the good times we had, the bad times we had. I remember the sadness when I found out that she was sick and dying of cancer. I remember the hope when it looked like she was in remission. And I remember the sorrow that happened when I was not able to see her again because I lived too far away before she died. All of that backstory comes with this bowl that looks just like a rather perfect, ordinary bowl with an interesting design. So if we go back to the backstory from this segment of the Gospel of Matthew, we can even see a few verses back that there are already signs that Judas was up to something, signs that the chief priests, Pharisees were looking for a reason and a way to arrest Jesus. Signs from chapters before this where Jesus kept telling all the disciples that they would be going to Jerusalem, and he was definitely set on going there, and it was not going to be a good outcome. And time and again we saw how all the disciples resisted that message. We didn't hear particularly about Judas, but we can imagine. And when we jump in on today's reading, where we see Judas trying to sell out Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, we need to realize that it was probably not just a whim, but probably something he had been thinking about for a while, and probably something that Jesus, being a good friend of Judas, had begun to notice in Judas. The backstory probably includes that Jesus was beginning to notice that Judas just wasn't quite with him like he had been at one time, that he was distracted, that he was anxious, perhaps that he was even agitated. And so by the time we get to this meal where Jesus seems so calm and cool and collected, I think we need to realize that more than likely through the last couple of days, and maybe even beyond that, he had been going through hell, trying to deal with feelings he had about this man that he had trusted, Judas, this man that he had lived with and eaten with and traveled with, this man that he had depended on, this man that he had defended even when the other disciples weren't too happy with anything of the things that Judas was doing. He had to begin to have those feelings that you get when you know that you either have been betrayed or you're about to be betrayed. And that brings us to our own backstories, because there have been times for most of us when we've had feelings of betrayal. Sometimes perhaps it's been because we have a falling out with a friend and we feel betrayed by something that person says. Sometimes somebody does something and their intention was not to hurt us, but it turns out hurting us anyway. Sometimes we try to get our own point across and are misunderstood, and our own intentions are misunderstood, and we feel betrayed by our own intentions. And then there are also those times that we're sick or we're injured, or even as we get older in the natural process of aging, that we begin to feel like our bodies are betraying us. We know the feelings that come with that feeling of betrayal. We know that shock at first, where we want to deny that anything is really happening. We know that feeling when we would give anything and we will try anything to fix the problem. We know that feeling when we can't fix it, of anger and rage, that it exists. We know that feeling of deep, down to the bone sorrow. And then finally we come to that point, after going through and back through all these feelings many times, we come to that point when we realize and accept that whether we like it or not, we can't fix it. It's not going to go away. And whatever we saw as a betrayal is simply going to have to stand as it is. So when we meet Jesus at this dinner, we can assume that he's been through all of that and is getting to the point where he realizes it's going to happen and Judas is going to be the one. And he's ready to tell Judas, just go ahead and get on with it. But who is this Jesus for us? This Jesus who has been through all of the same kinds of feelings we have. This Jesus who has had to deal with his own times of betrayal. This is the Jesus who can stand with us. This is the Jesus who can feel with us. This is the Jesus upon whom we can call when we find ourselves in those times of betrayal. Years ago, I was at an interfaith conference. And at that conference, I learned the word namaste for the first time. And since that time, I've heard many different definitions of the word namaste. It's a Hindu word. It's a greeting in India. And it's used often with just a little bow. Namaste. The definition that I heard the first time is the one that stayed with me. It was introduced by a friend, and that friend said, when I say namaste, what I'm saying is the spirit within me greets the spirit within you. And I think that's what happens when we call upon the Jesus who has been through the same kind of betrayals that we go through in our own life. I think that Jesus is the Jesus for us, who seeks us out before we even know we've been sought, and whispers into our heart and mind and spirit, namaste. The spirit within me, Jesus, who knows what it is to be betrayed, greets the spirit that is within you in all of your pain. Who is this Jesus who sits at table with his betrayer? He is the Jesus who says to us, namaste. Blessings. And join me again tomorrow. The video for Tuesday will be posted by 5 p.m., but you can view it any time after that.